This presentation deals with the origins of the Cold War. If you've gotten to this point, you should have finished the unit on World War II. The central historical question for this unit is to determine who was primarily responsible for the Cold War, the United States or the Soviet Union. If you've taken a previous history class, you should have a little bit of background information about the Cold War. Some of the things that you may want to brush up on are the differences between communism and capitalism, the alliances between the US and the Soviet Union in World War II, the state of Europe post-World War II, and the existence of the Soviet Red Army in Eastern Europe. We won't go too much into detail to any of those facts, but they're good to have in your toolbox. We're going to start by looking at the timeline of the early Cold War. You have a copy of that. And I'm going to use some slides to draw attention to key events of the Cold War. So if you're looking at your timeline, the very first event you'll see in 1945, February 4th through 11th is the Yalta Conference. In August 6th of that same year, the United States used its first atomic bomb in war. August 8th, 1945, Russia entered war against Japan. August 14th of 1945, the Japanese surrendered, which ended World War II. So you'll note from this timeline that the United States used its atomic bomb against Japan. Russia was allied with the United States and entered the war against Japan, causing Japan to surrender and ending World War II. So that is the official end of World War II. In March of 1946, Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech. You can see on the slide the map of the Iron Curtain. That red line that heads down the middle indicates the line between communist countries and other territories gained by the USSR in 1945. In your student documents, you have a copy of the Iron Curtain speech. The next slide focuses on the Truman Doctrine, 1947. Again, you have a copy of the Truman Doctrine in your student documents. And if you look on that timeline, the Truman Doctrine was a year later, March of 1947, and it was President Truman's outline to a joint session of Congress in March of 1947. The third document will be the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was announced just a few short months later in June of 1947. And on this slide, you can see a map that shows how the plan's $20 billion of aid was distributed by country. And that photo on the left shows the delivery of wheat from the US being unloaded in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And so the Marshall Plan was a plan of United States aid that would go to a variety of governments. The next thing on your timeline talks about a communist takeover in Czechoslovakia in 1948. In June of that same year, the Berlin blockade begins. And then in July of 1940, the NATO treaty was ratified, the North Atlantic Trade Organization. So the Berlin blockade has to do with a blocking of aid in Berlin, Germany. And the NATO treaty has to do with trade organizations and laws organized around trade. The Warsaw Pact in 1955 also deals with trade. To finish out your timeline, you'll notice May 12th of 1949 is when the Berlin blockade ended. September of 1949, Mao Zedong took over China. September of 1949, again, the Soviets exploded the first atomic bomb, and that Warsaw Pact 1955 in May. So the central historical question here is who started the Cold War? Over the past decades, historians have actually disagreed over this question. Your job is to look closely at some Cold War documents in order to address the question for yourself. As I mentioned, you have 5 documents aside from your timeline. You have document A, the Iron Curtain speech, document B, the Truman Doctrine, document C, the Soviet ambassador telegram, document D by Henry Wallace, and then the final document, instead of being a primary source, is your guiding questions to answer. So the guiding questions go along with each of the 4 previous documents: the speech, the doctrine, the telegram, and the letter. You're going to use these documents, the timeline, and the information from this presentation to try to determine for yourself who you believe started the Cold War.